In April 1945, 3 U.S. Army trucks marked with red crosses left Bastogne carrying medical supplies for forward hospitals. Departure logged at 5 p.m. Cargo manifest stamped, signatures correct. By midnight, no convoy arrived. The Army declared fog of war and sent families telegrams of regret. Case closed. No remains recovered. 40 years later. A drought exposed the valley reservoir that had drowned the old road. Anglers pulled a corroded steel panel from the mud, beneath layers of olive drab. A red cross bled through. Inspector Clara Weiss reviewed the find and froze. Official records said battlefield loss. The evidence said concealment. When the cranes raised the first truck, canvas split and a logbook fell out, charred on its edges. The title stamped in block letters, "Hand over records." Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. The convoy left Bastogne under gray skies. April thaw turned the Ardennes roads into veins of mud, yet orders were precise: 3 medical trucks, canvas covered, each marked with a red cross broad enough to be seen from air. At 5 p.m., Lieutenant Robert Keene signed the manifest. His name appeared above the list of surgical supplies, plasma kits, and morphine cartons. The seal was pressed clean, wax unbroken. Drivers checked engines. Headlights blinked once in sequence, routine in every way, from a command shack. Radio logs marked the departure. Static gave way to a final burst of acknowledgement convoy moving south toward relief stations. The time was logged at 5:07 p.m. Then silence. No further signals, no cries of distress, no terrain reports. A channel that should have carried mundane updates went dead without notice. Sergeant Walter Briggs guided the lead truck out of Bastogne. Witnesses along the road remembered the deep tread tracks pressed into wet earth. Headlights dimmed to half strength. Villagers waved, some crossing themselves as the trucks passed. The war was nearly over, but convoys still meant risk. Rumors of ambush units drifted with smoke from farm chimneys. By dusk, the trail of tire marks faded into woods. No one saw them emerge. At midnight, military police stationed along the southern artery reported absence. No trucks had arrived. Patrols sent back north found no overturned wrecks, no burned cargo, no shell casings. Roadside ditches showed only the natural wash of rainwater. Search parties traced every turnoff for 12 miles. Each ended in emptiness. By morning, staff officers filed the first internal note: 3 medical trucks overdue, presumed delayed. The following day, a second note: convoy missing, cause undetermined. Then the phrase that closed too many files in those months: fog of war. For families, the telegrams arrived with mechanical detachment. Evelyn Keene opened hers in a boarding house kitchen, the envelope bearing the War Department crest. The message contained no explanation, only regret, signed in a different hand than the manifest her brother had completed hours before vanishing. Other families received the same boilerplate condolences: no mention of wreckage, no offer of a grave. Weeks later, war's end eclipsed the loss. Towns celebrated liberation. Records shifted to demobilization. The missing trucks, once a matter of urgency, shrank to a single line in a quarterly report: assets unrecovered, personnel unaccounted, case closed. Yet fragments lingered. A requisition clerk filed the cargo manifest among completed shipments instead of missing lists. When the paper was re-examined years later, faint smudges of red soil stained its corner. Analysis showed traces of chalky limestone not found in Bastogne but further east. Near valley ridges later flooded for a reservoir, a detail unnoticed, filed away in silence. Inspector Clara Weiss would study that manifest decades later. Holding the sheet under sterile light, the paper had aged brittle, the ink feathered into parchment fibers, yet the seal impression remained clear. She ran her finger over the raised wax and noted the sharp cut of the stamp. No cracks, no tampering, official in every sense, and yet the convoy had disappeared as if into water. She laid the manifest beside a map from 1945. The road traced a line into forest, then stopped at an area now submerged beneath reservoir depths. Coordinates intersected with a zone marked unstable ground in post-war surveys. Weiss noted the alignment, circled it, and folded the map closed. The convoy's last confirmed existence lived only in these artifacts: a signature, a seal, a timestamp in static, and faint tracks long since washed away. From there, nothing, no debris, no survivors, no explanation. The trucks left at 5 p.m. They never arrived. The Red Cross was painted twice. Telegram envelopes reached across the ocean like small coffins. Families of the men assigned to the convoy opened them in kitchens, post offices, and rented rooms. The language was uniform: regret to inform. Convoy lost under combat conditions, remains unrecovered. Each closed with a typed signature block that carried no human hand. Evelyn Keene, sister of Lieutenant Robert Keene, studied hers under lamplight. The lettering slanted faintly, as if the machine had been misaligned. She compared it to an earlier letter her brother had sent home. The typeface matched, but the signature at the bottom did not. In Bastogne. Military records officers marked the convoy as missing final. Supplies were written off the ledger. Personnel were declared administratively dead within months. Colin James Harrow, head of logistics, stamped the closure with an iron seal. He told families that no further inquiry could be pursued. The war had shifted, fronts collapsed, records scattered. For the men listed, the Army would provide no graves, no honors. Evelyn kept her telegram folded inside a Bible. She returned to it each year, pressing the paper flat, tracing the lines, asking the same question: why no remains? Why no confirmation? The absence was worse than death. Decades later. Inspector Clara Weiss examined the telegram in Evelyn's possession. The ink had faded to pale violet, but the War Department crest still glinted faintly in embossed relief. Weiss compared the seal to another condolence telegram from the same month. The crests matched. The signatures did not. One carried the hand of an adjutant known to Harrow's office. The other bore a forged flourish traced by someone unlisted in personnel rolls. Weiss placed the two side by side beneath magnification. Microscopic ridges of the pen stroke suggested a deliberate attempt to mimic the official hand. The imposture was crude enough to catch a forensic eye, but subtle enough to slip past grieving relatives in 1945. Laura Keene, granddaughter of Evelyn, sat beside Weiss during the review. She was 35, a school teacher, hair pulled back, voice even. She had grown up under the shadow of that telegram. The family never spoke Robert's name. The document had become both death certificate and silencer. When she saw the inconsistency revealed under glass, her voice tightened. They didn't just lose him, they erased him. Weiss recorded the findings in her case log. She photographed the telegram, noted the mismatched signature, and preserved the paper in a protective sleeve. She logged the crest embossing, noting the unique die pattern. Each detail would become a data point against the official record. Back in the archives, she traced the chain of signatures used on similar notifications. Every telegram from Harrow's department in spring 1945 bore identical signatories except those tied to the missing convoy. There, substitutions appeared. names that dissolved into clerical fog. The convoy had not only vanished, its paperwork had been laundered. The silence of the families deepened. Many burned photographs, convinced their relatives had been traitors or deserters. Some moved away, severing connections. Evelyn never married. She clung to the paper as the last remnant of her brother's existence. Now Laura carried that inheritance. Sitting in the archive's dim light, she told Weiss, "We were told there was nothing to find, that it was shameful even to ask. But the ink says otherwise." Weiss closed her notebook. She had worked enough disappearances to know when a file carried false weight. The telegram was not just notification, it was cover. She left the building with copies secured in an evidence folder. Outside, rain began to fall across the empty streets. In the puddles, reflected light bent the crest into a broken circle. Weiss stared at the distortion, then turned away. 2 seals, 2 stories, 1 lie. In 1952, a junior clerk named Daniel Rosner pulled down a stack of prisoner exchange files from the restricted shelves at Met's depot. He was 34, a man of order, who underlined digits twice in red pencil before filing them away. That day he cross-referenced a shipment sheet from 1945 against a roster of repatriated German officers, a sequence of numbers repeated where it should not. Prisoner identification tags, 6 digits long, matched entries in both lists. They belonged simultaneously to men who had been reported dead and to new names entered months later as American servicemen. Rosner hesitated, copied the numbers onto a slip, and took them to his superior, Captain Harold Lyons. Lyons glanced once and folded the paper. "Misfiled," he said flatly, sliding the slip into his pocket. Hours later, Rosner returned to the shelves. The original folders were gone. In their place sat blank binders, spines labeled "transferred." He never saw the documents again. 20 years later, the slip of paper resurfaced in Rosner's effects after his death. His widow delivered it to archives, thinking it an odd keepsake. Weiss found it sealed in an envelope marked "cross-match." The digits were clear, despite age. She laid the slip beside the convoy's cargo manifest. The numbers aligned exactly with serials listed under personnel transfer. The trucks had not carried only bandages and plasma. They had carried names. Weiss traced the chain of custody. The manifest bore the signature of Lieutenant Robert Keene. The cross-match list bore the hidden notation "exchange priority." Both carried dates within the same week. No record mentioned arrival of those trucks at field hospitals. Instead, the same prisoner IDs emerged months later in rolls of naturalized Allied personnel. She ordered forensic examination of the ink. Results came back within days. The manifest entries had been overwritten, faint impressions visible beneath the top line. The original names were German, the replacements American. Laura Keene stood silent as the results were read. She pressed her hand against the glass where the manifest was displayed. The faint indentations showed through, ghost lines beneath bold ink. Her grandfather's brother had signed a document that recorded men traded like currency, identities altered under a painted cross. Weiss photographed each page, logged the overlays, and sealed them in evidence sleeves. She wrote the conclusion. Without flourish, convoy cargo consisted of personnel records reassigning prisoner identities. The archive grew quiet as the lights dimmed for closing. Weiss lingered, staring at the smudged digits. She thought of Rosner, copying numbers in silence, knowing he would never be allowed to speak. She thought of Lyons, folding the slip, choosing erasure over record. The convoy had not been lost to battle. It had been redirected into shadow. German IDs under American names. Elise Moreau was 89 when Clara Weiss found her in a stone farmhouse above the valley. She had been a girl in 1945, 12 years old, when she watched 3 trucks idle without headlights outside her uncle's barn. The night was cold enough that breath hung pale. Through slats in the barn wall, she saw soldiers painting by lamplight. First came red, broad strokes across canvas, then olive paint layered thickly over the same crosses. She remembered the dripping sound more than the color, a steady fall onto packed dirt. Her uncle had told her never to speak of it, yet when Weiss placed the faded convoy photograph on the table, Elise touched the edges with trembling fingers. The cross was there, she whispered. They made it disappear. Weiss collected soil samples from the barn floor, long hardened into clay. In the lab, microscopic flakes of pigment were found embedded in the grain. Spectrographic analysis showed 2 layers, a lower band of iron oxide red and an upper coat of military olive drab. The overlap proved repainting, not manufacture. The sample was logged, photographed, and sealed in a numbered bag. Weiss added it to her growing file. She now had proof that the convoy's markings had been altered in the hours before disappearance. Laura Keene read the report beside her. They turned an emblem of mercy into camouflage, she said flatly. The bitterness in her voice carried decades of family silence. Weiss traced the chain again. Orders for medical convoys bore strict inspection protocols. Tampering with markings required authorization. She cross-checked signatures. Each pointed back to Colonel James Harrow, head of logistics. Harrow's initials appeared in requisition forms dated the night before the convoy rolled. He had approved repainting under the designation operational secrecy. At archives, the requisition form showed faint heat damage along its edges, as if exposed to flame. Someone had tried to destroy it, yet the ink still spoke. Weiss wrote her finding in precise language. Evidence confirms deliberate repainting of convoy insignia from medical to standard military, executed under authority of Harrow. She filed the sample report, closed the folder, and looked once more at Elise. The woman stared at the photograph, lips pressed thin, eyes wet. We were told never to speak, but the paint stayed under our nails for weeks. Weiss logged her testimony. She left the farmhouse at dusk, carrying the sealed bag of pigment and the memory of dripping paint. Mercy repainted for war. Reservoir maps spread across the archive table in layered sheets. Weiss overlaid the 1945 military survey with post-war engineering plans. The road that had once cut south through the valley now ran straight into water. A red pencil traced its path until it disappeared beneath blue shading. Notes in the margin of the engineering file confirmed blasting of outcrops, grading of embankments, and detonation of charges before the floodgates closed. Weiss examined the detonation reports. A line item listed clearance of unstable ground at coordinates matching the convoy's last known position. Charges had been placed in May 1946, less than a year after the disappearance. The construction office called it routine preparation for the dam. But the report carried Harrow's initials again. She compared photographs, a pre-war aerial showing the road intact, a post-war survey showing nothing but water. The trucks had vanished into the very ground later buried by flood. Weiss suspected the vehicles were not destroyed by combat, but deliberately sealed beneath the reservoir's rising depths. She ordered a soil core drilled at the water's edge. The sample returned with unexpected residue microfragments of canvas fiber pressed into silt layers, dated to the year of flooding. The fibers matched standard-issue U.S. Army truck covers, proof that material had settled before inundation. Laura Keene studied the overlay maps with silent intensity. Her finger followed the pencil line from Bastonia into water. "The road ends where the truth begins," she said, voice low. She had grown up beside this reservoir, swimming its shallow banks, never knowing what lay beneath. Weiss logged the sample and photographed the overlays. She annotated the margin convoy path coincides with later blast zone, evidence of intentional submergence, in a locked cabinet. She placed the fiber evidence, the detonation reports, and the aerials together. Each artifact carried the same silent message: the trucks had not been lost. They had been placed. That night, rain fell heavy against the reservoir wall, water sluiced from spillways, echoing across the valley. Weiss stood on the dam's crest, looking down into black depths where no headlights had ever reappeared. Road ends where water begins. By late summer, the valley cracked under record drought. Reservoir levels fell lower than any surveyor had recorded. Mud flats stretched wide. Reed beds dried to brittle husks. Local anglers dragged their boats across exposed channels to reach what little water remained. It was there, near the center basin, that Mark Duval pulled up his line, snagged on corroded steel. He scraped away moss and found paint peeling beneath his knife. Under olive flakes, a cross of faded red bled through. News reached the district office within hours. Inspector Clara Weiss arrived at dawn, stepping through mud that clutched her boots. Duval led her to the panel propped against rocks. Even in weak morning light, the geometry of the cross was unmistakable. Weiss photographed it from every angle, tagging coordinates, measuring scale. The panel's rivet holes matched standard dimensions of 1940s U.S. Army truck sides. She sent a sample for spectrographic testing. Results confirmed two coats, the lower iron oxide red and the upper olive drab. Both wartime formulations. The paint was not age-stained confusion. It was deliberate overmarking. Weiss requested sonar sweeps of the basin. The first scans revealed three upright shapes in grid alignment, each the size of a 2.5-ton truck. They rested half-buried in silt. Canvas tops collapsed, but hulls intact. She filed her request for retrieval, marking it urgent. Heavy rains forecast in 3 days threatened to refill the basin. If recovery was delayed, the evidence would sink back underwater, at headquarters. Authorizations moved slowly. Risk assessments, safety warnings, budget lines. Weiss bypassed channels and contacted a salvage crew directly. By nightfall, cranes rolled onto the dam, floodlights rigged along the shore, divers entered the basin, lines trailing into black mud. Laura Keene stood at the rail with Weiss. She had never seen the reservoir so low, never imagined the ghost stories her grandmother whispered could harden into steel below. When the divers surfaced, they confirmed what sonar suggested: 3 intact trucks, sealed, doors shut. Weiss signed the order. The first winch cable tightened, drawing mud-streaked hulls up from silence. Pull them before the rain. The first truck broke the surface just after midnight. Floodlights washed across its canvas, torn and clinging to bent frames. Mud cascaded down in sheets. As the crane set the hull onto timber braces, the silence deepened. Soldiers, divers, and technicians circled but did not speak. Weiss approached, clipboard in hand, recording each detail with cold precision. The olive paint had blistered, but beneath the ruptured canvas, white stenciling bled through personnel transfer, not medical, not relief. She ordered the rear doors cut open. The hinges resisted, sealed by decades of rust. When the lock finally snapped, a gust of rot and mildew burst out. Inside, crates lined both sides. Some had collapsed, wood reduced to pulp. Others remained intact, lids marked with serials, none indicating medical supplies. At the center, Weiss saw a bundle of charred pages bound by brittle twine. She lifted it carefully with gloves. The cover bore block letters pressed in half-burned ink, hand-over records. She set the bundle on a sterile cloth. Pages flaked away with each movement. The legible fragments listed names and dates. Organized in columns, American ranks stood beside German surnames, each paired by penciled arrows. Some lines ended in check marks, others in X's. Weiss photographed each sheet, catalogued each fragment, and sealed them in numbered sleeves. Laura Keene leaned over the railing, eyes fixed on the interior. Her face reflected the beam of floodlights. "This wasn't medicine," she said. "It was trade." Weiss continued cataloging. Near the rear, divers recovered a small iron key fused into a lump of tar. The shaft bore stamped numbers, its teeth blackened by exposure. The tar residue was tested on site, revealing traces of creosote, a compound used in military sealants. The key did not match the truck's locks. Its origin remained unresolved. By dawn, the second and third trucks had been lifted. One held more crates, stamped in faded stencil. The other was nearly empty, save for broken straps and rusted hooks. Each bore the same marking beneath layers of canvas personnel transfer. Weiss assembled the evidence, the logbook fragments, the fused key, the crates without medical labels. She logged the time, 6:45 a.m. Rain clouds already massed on the horizon. If recovery had been delayed one more day, the reservoir would have hidden the hulls again. The trucks sat in silence on timber blocks, mud draining from their frames, evidence heavy in their sealed interiors. The key doesn't fit mercy. The hangar lights burned white across rows of crates lifted from the first truck. Technicians laid them out on tarps, cataloging each with numbered tags. Weiss moved slowly between them, recording dimensions, photographing markings. Several lids gave way under pressure, revealing reels of 16mm film preserved in waxed cartons. Labels, handwritten in fading ink, bore dates later than the convoy's disappearance. Weiss prepared a projection test. In a darkened chamber, the first reel flickered to life. Grainy images appeared operating tables, surgical lamps, masked figures moving with mechanical precision. At first glance, a medical training sequence. Yet details unsettled instruments arranged without sterilization. Incisions drawn but never made. Subjects lying motionless, unreactive. The procedures were staged. She paused the frame and advanced slowly. A face filled the screen. It was not a patient, but a prisoner. Tag around his neck, features rigid, eyes open but unblinking. A second reel showed tags swapped American names replacing German ones. The handwriting blunt. Strokes pressed with urgency. Dr. Helene Kruger. A forensic specialist called from Brussels examined the labels under magnification. She confirmed handwriting variations, noting at least 3 distinct scribes. They weren't documenting surgery, she said. They were documenting substitution. Laura Keene sat in the corner, watching the flicker on the wall. She recognized the surname on one tag. A German officer listed in post-war rosters as repatriated to Allied custody. Here he was, alive under a different name, days after the convoy had disappeared. Weiss ordered the reels scanned frame by frame. Each bore silent evidence hands exchanging tags, files stamped with new numbers, crates labeled with falsified origins, the Red Cross insignia, once a symbol of neutrality, appeared in backgrounds, painted panels hauled into view, used as backdrop to reinforce the cover. Among the reels lay smaller canisters marked retakes when developed. They showed the same scenes repeated with minor adjustments, clearer angles of tags, closer shots of faces. These were not medical films. They were records of identity being overwritten. Weiss logged the canisters, numbered them, and placed them into archival storage. She noted their condition, labeling, and inconsistencies. Each entry became another nail against the official story. Laura spoke finally, voice thin but steady. They didn't just lose him. They gave him away. Faces kept, names erased. The logbook fragments were spread across the evidence table, their edges curled and blackened. Under angled light, Weiss traced faint pencil marks that had survived the burn. The pages listed serial numbers, each corresponding to a captured officer. German surnames crossed with American ranks. Margins carried terse notes, approved, withheld, priority. Some lines bore heavy strokes of X, others were checked in careful script. Cross-referencing began. Weiss pulled rolls from Allied repatriation archives, matching dates and prisoner IDs. The overlap was undeniable. Several German officers declared dead in late 1944 reappeared in 1946 under new identities, attached to American units or transferred into administrative positions. The logbook's arrows aligned with those resurfacings. Forensic handwriting analysis confirmed at least two contributors. One matched the requisition orders signed by Colonel James Harrow. The other remained unidentified, but pressure ridges suggested a heavier hand accustomed to stamping forms. Weiss presented the findings to Laura Keene in the dim light of the archive room. Laura scanned the columns, lips pressed tight. At the bottom of one page she saw her uncle's signature, the ink dark against the charred paper. It validated his presence, his final duty, yet beside it. Penciled arrows linked his signature to names that did not belong. Weiss retrieved soil samples from the truck interiors. Analysis showed traces of lime and ash consistent with temporary holding pits. Fibers clinging to crate seams matched uniforms, not American, but German field gray. The convoy had carried more than paper. It had transported men under cover of medical insignia. Laura stepped back, shaken. They buried the trucks to bury the trade, she said quietly. Her voice carried the weight of a family silenced for decades. Weiss logged the discovery in plain language. Evidence demonstrates convoy functioned as exchange mechanism for high-value prisoners. Official record misrepresents deaths as battlefield casualties. The burned logbook, once nearly destroyed, had revealed its purpose. Not a list of cargo, not a record of loss. A ledger of barter, names traded like currency. Weiss turned next to the archive of intelligence memoranda from 1946. Most bore routine language post-war reconstruction, demobilization schedules, shipping tallies, but buried within a restricted folder marked medical repatriation lay a single sheet stamped OSS. The heading read, Operational Anomaly Convoy Loss, Ardennes Sector. The memorandum summarized the disappearance in one paragraph, citing hostile terrain and unstable roadbeds, yet beneath the typed account. A handwritten annotation cut across the margin, convoy secured, records sealed by directive, no further inquiry authorized. The initials beside the note matched Harrow's. Weiss pressed the sheet under magnification. The ink bled differently than the typed text. Darker, heavier. Applied after the page left the machine. No carbon copy existed. The annotation was singular, meant for internal eyes only. She traced other files in the folder. Several bore unusual routing slips, marked not to logistics or quartermaster divisions, but to intelligence liaison offices in London and Washington. Each had been signed received, then stamped classified. None carried responses. Weiss catalogued the memorandum, photographing its marginal note. She logged it as forensic anchor, the first direct confirmation that higher officers knew of the convoy's true fate. Laura read the line aloud, her voice steady but bitter, secured, sealed, no further inquiry. She folded her arms. That's not loss. That's intent. Weiss checked chain of custody stamps. The sheet had passed through at least 4 hands before reaching archive. One belonged to a liaison officer later attached to prisoner interrogations in Frankfurt. Another to a War Department clerk who disappeared from records in 1947. The memorandum was not alone. A second file contained requisition forms for personnel exchange, medical cover. The language was coded, but plain enough to eyes trained in substitution. It had been approved 2 days before the convoy rolled. Weiss placed the files into evidence sleeves. She recorded the date, time, and page count. The picture was clear. The trucks had been painted, loaded, and rerouted under orders reaching beyond logistics. Families had been handed telegrams of regret. Headquarters had been handed silence. The truth had been sealed in a single sentence across a margin. Records don't vanish. They are buried alive. By the time recovery made headlines, photographs of the mud-caked trucks were already circulating. Local papers splashed grainy images under stark titles, "Ghost Convoy Rises from Reservoir." National outlets followed with sharper language. Army secrets surface after 40 years. Families who had lived with silence saw their grief turned into copy. Laura Keene stood before cameras at a press conference in Bastogne. Her words were measured, her expression steady. "We were told our relatives died in the fog of war. We now know they were erased." Behind her, enlarged images of the convoy stood mounted on boards, trucks streaked with algae, crates stenciled personnel transfer, fragments of burned logbooks sealed in plastic. Weiss refused interviews, but her findings spoke through documents released to journalists. Forensic photographs showed pigment layers of red and olive. Soil cores revealed canvas fibers locked in silt. Cross-referenced ledgers matched prisoner IDs overwritten with American names. Each page told a story of concealment, not accident. Reaction spread quickly. Some veterans condemned the revelations, claiming they tarnished wartime sacrifice. Others demanded inquiry into how Red Cross symbols had been abused for clandestine trades. In villages along the reservoir, older residents admitted long-held suspicions. Elise Moreau, now frail, told a reporter, "We saw the crosses painted twice. They made us promise silence. Now the paint speaks louder than our fear." The Army issued statements denying systemic wrongdoing, citing chaotic conditions of 1945. Officials framed the convoy as an isolated irregularity under review. Yet leaked memoranda revealed Harrow's authorizations and OSS routing slips. The language of intent undercut every denial. In Laura's home, telegrams once folded away in drawers were laid out on tables for reporters. She pointed to mismatched signatures, embossed crests, the brittle paper her grandmother had kept for decades. "This was our coffin," she said. "They built it with ink." Weiss archived the coverage as part of the case file. Newspaper clippings became forensic artifacts in themselves, evidence of how communities processed delayed truth. The photographs, headlines, and interviews layered a second record atop the first, the record of exposure. One morning, Laura found a letter slipped under her door. The envelope bore no return address, only a typed line, "Some trades should remain forgotten." Inside lay a photocopy of a prisoner roster with her uncle's name crossed out. No explanation, only the mark. She delivered it to Weiss. The inspector examined the ink. The toner was modern. The message was current. Even in revelation, the cover remained alive. Autumn rain returned, filling the reservoir inch by inch. By November, water covered the basin where the trucks had rested, leaving only ripples across a dark surface. The wrecks now sat in fenced hangars, guarded, sealed under tarpaulins. Weiss kept the evidence locked in climate-controlled vaults, pigment samples, charred logbook pages, reels of film, each item catalogued, each tagged, each impossible to deny. A commission convened in Brussels, its members gray-haired and cautious. Witnesses testified: Elise Moreau recalling the dripping paint, Laura Keene presenting her family's telegram, Weiss laying out forensic photographs. The board listened, recorded, then recessed without comment. Their final report was short: matter remains under review. The language felt identical to 1945, as if 40 years had not passed. Public interest waned as other stories crowded headlines. Veterans protested outside hearings. Families demanded graves, but no remains were produced. The trucks had carried records, not bodies. The men listed were long absorbed into new identities or vanished into archives. One night, Weiss returned alone to the evidence hangar. She unlocked the case containing the reels, frame by frame. She advanced through the images, hands exchanging tags, crosses in the background, faces frozen beneath new names. She stopped at one frame, an officer with American insignia stitched over a German tunic. The tag at his neck bore a name still listed as missing in official records. She printed the frame, logged it, and sealed it away. The image was more than evidence. It was indictment. Laura visited the reservoir once more before winter. She stood on the dam as wind swept across the rising water. "They told us the road ended in fog," she said softly. "It ended in trade." Her words carried no triumph, only exhaustion, for Weiss. The case closed not with verdict, but with weight. The trucks were not accidents of war, nor mysteries of terrain. They were instruments, vehicles built to carry silence forward, disguised in symbols of mercy. The water covered the basin again, flat and unbroken. Beneath, memory lay submerged. The Red Cross was camouflage for betrayal.